Hello, hello, hello. Thanks for joining, everybody. Get started here officially in just a moment. I'm Dave. You are watching Krakoa, Casual Krakoa live. Thank you for joining. Gonna do an official start here in like 30 seconds. But yeah, today we're gonna be talking about what's next. What comes next? Soon you'll see. Right? Right? You guys know that one? You're talking what comes next for X-Men Comics after the 2021 Hellfire Gala crossover. We'll let some people hop on here, I think, as things start. We're going to be talking about X-Men Comics that came out today. We've got XFactor number 10 and Cable number 11. We're talking then about kind of the Hellfire Gala as a whole. You know, now that it is officially done, this month has been the Hellfire Gala month. Those of you who are on early for the live stream here, one, thanks so much for joining. And two, let me know what you think of the sound quality and any issues with the stream here. But also, let's get in your questions. Let me know what your questions are here in the chat. I will try to answer as many as I can. Super chat is available. Okay, super chat is available for those of you who are generous enough to support Comic Book Herald, which is immensely, immensely appreciated. But without further ado, I think let's do this and let's talk X-Men Comics. Hello, and welcome to Casual Krakoa. I'm Dave Busing, founder and editor-in-chief of comicbookherald.com. Again, you are listening to Casual Krakoa, where I talk through all of the day's X-Men comics the day they came out, as well as some thoughts and big picture stuff on theories, where things are going, what's to come, and all that fun stuff, right? So thanks everybody here who is joining me live. Again, these are live every Wednesday when the comics come out. I really appreciate everybody who's been hopping on, having a good conversation, and asking good questions. Only thing I ask is, of course, be respectful to those around you. And yeah, share as many good questions as you want. And again, Super Chat is active for those who want to get those in. I will prioritize those and get to as many as I can. But today, let's start by talking about the comics that came out today. We had XFactor number 10, the series conclusion, and we had Cable number 11, okay, which is the penultimate issue in what is going to be a 12-issue series by Jerry Duggan and Phil Noto. Now, XFactor number 10, it is the series conclusion. It is officially the end of the Hellfire Gala, and it is a controversial and complicated comic book. Okay, I think that much is true. There has been a lot of conversation about the way that this story ends, and particularly the way that it ends sort of the mystery and the intrigue set up around the character Prodigy, who's been on this X-Factor unit since the beginning. I covered this in detail on the Krakoa official. It's episode 191. If you want the full review and my full thoughts, I would recommend and appreciate it if you would go check out XFactor number 10 over there. Because I definitely want it helps me to write down my thoughts when discussing complicated issues like that rather than going off the cuff. Nonetheless, it's complicated. It's a very messy ending to, I think, an otherwise important and very high quality book. I think even for those, and often there were times where I was like, well, this isn't for me, but I recognize a craft within XFactor that I appreciate the heck out of in terms of relationship development, in terms of character work. I mean, Leah Williams, we're just looking at the run as a whole. There are characters in this book, and I've said this before, that I like more now than I ever have in Marvel Comics history, okay? It's true of Lorna Dane, Polaris. It's true of D'Ken, Wolverine's son. It's true of Northstar. I mean, you go on down the line, and it's like player after player after player. I'm like, oh, this is the peak. This is actually the most I've really liked these characters. And that's definitely to the creative team's credit. I think Dave Vallion's been doing some of the best work, particularly with like the way that he's leaned into iBoy's power set as a way to creatively show what is happening on the page, and just the panel layouts and the visuals, and really integrate that synergy between like what this character's power set is and how we show that visually. Really, really fascinating work. So again, I think as a whole, when you look back on the series, there's really a lot of positive to look at. But I think the last issue is definitely not that. I think it's at best very messy and misguided. And it's a bit of a misstep. And I think, a lot of fans I've seen today saying you can extend some leniency, because this book almost like clearly this book was not clearly, I guess, but it got canceled, right? Like the book got canceled. It's only going to go 10 issues. I don't have any inside information, obviously, on the behind the scenes of that. It's the transition here certainly looks like Leah Williams writes this for 10 issues, and now she's going to go into writing Trial of Magneto, which is this huge 5-issue, massive basically event. I mean, it doesn't appear to have like tie-in comics as of yet. Maybe it will. But it's playing out like an event. And honestly, I think as we talk about what Trial of Magneto is going to be, as we talk about what's next for X-Men comics in 2021, it's like a soft Avengers versus X-Men 2.0. Like it's a pretty clever way to get around calling something an Avengers versus X-Men 2.0. So I think that's going to be a big responsibility. That's going to be a big endeavor. Like there's a creative part of it where it's like that makes sense to take her off a book. But XFactor getting canceled, when you compare it to the rest of the line, like it just doesn't. Even with my issues with today's comic, with issue 10, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. Apart from that, on a qualitative basis, on a sales basis, however you want to look at it, you could go on through the X line even. Forget comparing it to other Marvel books where it's like clearly better. But even if you compare it throughout the X line, like what is the differentiation? What's the point of differentiation here between XFactor and Excalibur, for example? Or, I mean, like even something like a Wolverine, for me, it's like XFactor is clearly better, but Wolverine is Wolverine. So I get that, right? That's not a secret. But either way, it's the last issue. It's done. And we're going to move on from there into the Trial of Magneto. And I'll talk about that as far as what's come. But, I think the other issue that came out today that I haven't talked about on the channel is Cable number 11. Now, again, like I said, this is writer Jerry Duggan. We got art by Phil Noto and letters by Joe Sabino. Again, this is one of the rare X books where we've had the same basically creative unit for the whole thing. You're going to get the same creative unit for all 12 issues, and that's definitely a net positive. It's not surprising what happened today. We've seen this coming for a long time. But Cable number 11, it is the official return. And I guess, I didn't say this up front, but spoilers for today's comics will be coming, okay? As well as a lot of summary and summation of what's happened in the Hellfire Gala to date. I will be talking about that in detail, so bail now. Bail now if you want. But this is the official return in Cable number 11 of Old Man Cable. And the most interesting things to me were not that Old Man Cable came back, although I have to say that was quite welcome. I'm not a Teen Cable hater. Like that didn't bother me that there have been stories of Teen Cable. I actually think it has really opened the doors for some Summers Family stuff that has been really, really fun and that I've enjoyed a heck of a lot. But getting Old Man Cable back, getting that sense of grizzled wisdom, that planning, and also like the fact that his first line is basically like back to Krakoa. Huh. Old Man Cable knows about Krakoa. That's interesting. I mean, one thing, and I've talked about this a fair amount, but one thing that has been missing in the Krakoa era of X-Men is like, okay, but what do time travelers know about Krakoa, and how does that differentiate from what a precognitive mutant knows? Because, so much of this era, of the Hickman era of X-Men, is colored by the fact that Moira X has said no precognitive mutants on Krakoa, both due to her, her, what do you call it? I want to say enemyship, but that doesn't feel right. Due to her disagreements with Destiny, as well as just the fact of like, okay, if mutants know our plans, it's going to go awry. But Cable knows about Krakoa. Okay, so he's experienced a whole bunch of timelines. He's at least experienced some version of Krakoa. I just find that fascinating. Like, I would like more from an Old Man Cable about like what is it that he knows. I mean, this is something that Bishop could also provide, but that thread has not been pulled at all. We actually, so I do the My Marvelous Year podcast with Zach Dean, and we read through the entire Marvel universe. Okay, we're reading through all the best stuff, all the essential Marvel comics. If you like that idea of starting from 1962 and making your way up, we're on 1992 right now in terms of where our episodes are at. And come join us. It's the My Marvelous Year podcast. I highly recommend it. But we actually just read and just recorded an episode where we talked about the debut of Bishop, and I was struck rereading those issues. We actually focused in on Uncanny X-Men 287 to 288, which is like the very tail end of the Bishop's Crossing saga, kind of in that Jim Lee, Whilce Portacio era post Claremont. And Bishop is such an X-Men fan in ways. When he comes back, his history, or his history is the history of the X-Men. And it's really fascinating, like his reverence for mutant figures and for X-Men that we know. That aspect of the character has been lost entirely. Like that is never touched on with the Bishop that we see in Marauders, where he's kind of just like Beast's, like, generally unwilling participant. So I think I would like to see more from Cable and Bishop as time travelers. I said this before, but on one hand, I can appreciate that, like, if time travel throws a wrench into the story, just ignoring it is kind of okay. Like, that's kind of an acceptable answer. But it kind of also just doesn't work in X-Men comics specifically, in the X-Men universe, because timelines from Cable, from Bishop, from Rachel Summers to Days of Future Past, it's an integral part of Nimrod's backstory. There's just too much interconnectivity there. So I do kind of feel like we're due for a little bit of like explanation about, like, okay, how does Cable know Krakoa? What does that mean? The explanation can be as simple as, like, it was an alternate timeline. That may not come to pass, right? You can talk around it. You can talk ways out of it where it's not like Cable knows what's coming, because if he does, now how is he not more of a threat than Destiny, right? So that piece was interesting. There's also a line in here in Cable 11. He says, we're still on the TVA's watch list and don't think they'll give you a pass for my crimes. I appreciate it here that the reference to the TVA, the Time Variance Authority, aka the new, like, most important agency in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? If you're watching Loki on Disney Plus, which I will not spoil in any fashion here. I liked the reference, and I also really like that it's not just like a trying to get the cred of Loki. Duggan actually used the TVA in his Despicable Deadpool run. This is something I talked about in my video on the Time Variance Authority that I put up not too long ago, and Cable and Deadpool ran into them there. So there's history with the creator there of actually being one of the very few modern creators to utilize them. So the fact that he's bringing it back is not exclusively like, oh, and they're in Loki, so we better mention them. So I appreciated that little nod as well, okay? But really, like, the main thing that happens by the end of this issue, which, Cable's not spinning a lot of plates in the air. It's really doing one thing, and it's doing, we got to bring old Cable back, and we got to bring him back because Strife is plotting what we are referring to apparently now as the Summers War in the Demon Lands, in these mysterious Demon Lands. Strife is basically plotting 1989's Inferno. like pretty much down to the letter. Strife is replicating the original Claremont et al. Inferno by kidnapping babies and manufacturing some sort of spiritual rite that will allow for his demon realms to be brought to Earth. It's kind of funny. I don't know how intentional the comedy is here, but, like, it's funny to see a villain trying to enact an Inferno 2.0 when we know full well, those of us who are obsessed with X-Men comics, that the next big X-Men event is going to be called Inferno and will really, without question, not be this. Like, it will not be redoing 1989's Inferno, but apparently that is what Strife is actually trying to do, which definitely tickled me a little bit, and I appreciate that. So Cable number 12, the Krakoan reads It Never Ends. Basically, it's going to be, Cable and the Summers family and getting the gang all together. They're going to have to go and stop Strife and his demon army. We know that at least Old Man Cable will succeed. There's already a solicit for Cable fully reloaded or something like that, and Cable's going to be in as a Last Annihilation tie-in, which we'll talk about that very briefly here. But like Old Man Cable's going to make it out. I guess the real question is young teen Cable actually going to survive this experience? And then will we have two Cables walking around Krakoa? Will we keep both characters? I mean, my expectation before this issue was definitely, okay, this is it for Teenage Cable. It's going to be the return of Old Man Cable, and then Teenage Cable will either sacrifice himself or through time shenanigans will leave, essentially. But now I'm kind of like, they might actually try to keep both of them, which raises some kind of weird and wild questions about who's allowed on Krakoa and resurrection protocols, right? Like there's been the Quiet Council has kind of put their foot down a little bit on clones, because that was inconvenient to resurrect Madeline Pryor, for example. But when it comes to Old Man Cable, they're like, cool, no problem. So there's a lot of semantic detail there in the who gets resurrected arguments that I think is very much open for debate. Like it's that very much, if they keep both characters, it's like, well, could you keep different versions of characters throughout that have traveled in time, or even that haven't yet but might one day? It's time travel, it gets weird, right? So that could be interesting, but it also could be massively complicated. I mean, the simplest answer would just be keep Old Man Cable, let Teen Cable sacrifice himself, and basically reset the clock. I don't know. That feels maybe too simple. Maybe you do keep both, because I really like the Summers family stuff. It's like Dad Cyclops is up my alley, even though historically he's been just as bad a dad as Professor X in many, many ways. So, all right. So those were the comics that came out today. Definitely let me know your thoughts here, or what is to come. So as far as Cable 11 too, I should say, like, it came out with the Hellfire Gala comics here. It's not a Hellfire Gala comic. It doesn't tie in any significant way at all. So as far as the Hellfire Gala, right, we had a month of mutant kind hosting the biggest party on Earth, inviting all sorts of humans and non-mutants and dignitaries and whatnot to this massive party, basically led by Emma Frost. And where did we net out? Okay, like, what did the Hellfire Gala get us? And the reality is, it got us some pretty big stuff. Like, we got some pretty nice revelations here. It really kicks off an official or an unofficial Reign of X in a way that I think is fairly satisfying. We get, in Planet-Size X-Men, we get Planet Arakko. We get Storm as Regent of Mars, which is fully populated with Arakko mutants, and Mars has been declared the capital of the solar system. That's all big stuff. That's all massive stuff that has not been played with in Marvel history. We do not have in the, what do we got, 2021, in the 60-plus year history of Marvel Comics, those stories have not been told. So that's exciting. Cool. Good new stories. The X-Men trying to fulfill their destiny now to conquer or establish an empire in the galaxy at large. That's good. I'm excited about that. Related to that, obviously, is what happens in Sword, where Mysterium, this artifact, or this resource that only mutants can get through their what do they call it? Through their ability to travel, through these mysterious realms, Manifold and the like on the Sword team. They pull a Mysterium. They're going to use that basically as the currency of the galaxy, as the most valuable economic resource. So it gives mutants leverage on Earth, as well as now in the galaxy, in terms of having financial leverage on all of the world's empires, with the exception of, like, the Intergalactic Empire of Wakanda, who does not need mutant metal. The other major thing that happens here, which happened in XFactor number 10 today, officially, even though if you've been following along Krakoa or Casual Krakoa, you saw this coming, was the death of Scarlet Witch. Okay, so the death of Scarlet Witch officially is shown on panel here at the very end of XFactor number 10, even though it's not at all a story about that. And the timeline of events that we know is Wanda shows up to the Hellfire Gala around 3 a.m. She shows up per an invitation from Magneto, is what she thinks. And they have a nice conversation. Magneto is a shockingly nice dad. Says he wants to bring his family back together. He'll do it, whatever it takes. And then we see an hour later, in Krakoa time, in Hellfire Gala time, we see Wanda lying dead, as discovered by her son, actually, Tommy. It looks, from the art, it looks like probably there was some sort of neck injury. I haven't watched a heck of a lot of, like, police procedurals, but I'm assuming they would describe it as blunt trauma to the neck, some sort of strangulation or attack of that manner. But regardless of I wouldn't say regardless of the method, because I actually do think that matters, because Magneto has killed. He knows murder. He's told us as much in Sword. He does not kill like that. So with it being a trial of Magneto, he might have been the last person to see Scarlet Witch. Is there really any likelihood that he was the one who did this deed? It seems very, very unlikely. I don't know even if the trial Like, will Magneto actually be put on trial for killing Wanda? Or will it be trial in the sense of, like, this is a trial of Magneto's to bring his family back together and to get what he wants, right? I actually think that's probably thematically more relevant. But this is, it's confirmed. It's Scarlet Witch. She was the favorite for the individual to be murdered, as was teased. That's going to set the stage for the Trial of Magneto event. And like I said, it's going to set up, kind of an Avengers versus X-Men 2.0, which I think is probably the smartest way to do that. I'm pretty opposed to an actual Avengers versus X-Men 2.0 event. For those who maybe jumped on with the Hickman Era, 2012, Marvel had a 12-issue event called Avengers vs. X-Men. It was written by basically everyone who was big at Marvel at the time. So you had like Brian Michael Bendis, you had Jonathan Hickman, you had maybe Fraction, Jason Aaron, right? Probably had Brubaker even still at that point, right? You had a whole bunch of these really talented writers that were part of the Marvel universe, and they all wrote this crossover. As events go, it's okay. It's middle of the road. There's some really good stuff actually, and some interesting concepts, and then there's some stuff that falls apart. It is far from the worst event. It's far from the worst event. Here's looking at you, 2014 Access. Here's looking at you, Civil War II, definitely worse than Access. But it's fine, but I'm not super eager for an Avengers versus X-Men battle. That feels played out. And the thing that I like about the Krakoa era is that idea, that concept of breaking all the rules, of doing new stuff with these characters. That is the thing that I like the most about shared superhero universes. Again, as someone who has read so much of this history, I'm not that interested in seeing things repeat. I've seen them. We have those comics. They're great. I enjoyed them, but I don't need them again. And I think, using Wanda as the basis for Avengers vs. X-Men 2.0 makes a lot of sense, because it also then ties into one of the bigger questions, one of the bigger sort of hanging threads in X-Men comics right now, which is Wanda Maximoff is the number 2 on Mutant Kind's, most hated enemy list. She, even at number 2, has the pervasive nickname of the Great Pretender, because nobody's talking about Cassandra Nova, which, why? That's a question we should be asking. But the Great Pretender is Wanda Maximoff, who said no more mutants famously, and decimated mutant kind. Literally, there's a whole era of decimation. And this is something that, if you read Scarlet Witch comics after this fact, she has tried time and time again to atone for. Marvel sort of editorially has tried to give her outs, and nothing has stuck. And I think that nothing has stuck, and also we're in danger of repeating ourselves again too, in terms of Wanda's atonement process. But it does need to happen. They're not wrong. This House of M No More Mutants thing is stuck to Scarlet Witch. It is absolutely stuck to her. Nothing she has done to date will help alleviate that. And to make matters worse, then in 2015 you have the Marvel retcon of editorially of saying actually Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch aren't mutants anymore, which, as a billion people have pointed out, is pretty clearly movie rights driven, right? It's at the time the MCU didn't have rights to the X-Men. They were mutant characters, so Marvel was like, no thank you. they don't need to be mutants anymore. So all of that is to say, the death of the Scarlet Witch, it sets up a really potentially interesting scenario in a lot of different ways, where you have questions now about who done it, which the idea that it's something I've tossed around a bunch is okay, is Mystique the one who sent the invitation? Is she pretending to be Magneto? We know Mystique is going to be building to getting revenge and basically burning it all down as we build to Inferno. So in terms of all right, the timeline, let's back that up even, and let's look at the events that are coming in the Marvel universe, in the X-Men universe. Let's see if I can actually get a good image here instead of whatever's going on with my screen right now. So all right, so first, in terms of the timeline, so the Hellfire Gala ends in June, right, which is where we are right now, and then we're going to have basically July through about mid-August, where X-Men comics can kind of just be Reign of X-Men comics. They're not going to be caught up in events until we get until the Last Annihilation with Al Ewing, and that's going to start on July 21st. Then you can go till August 18th with the Trial of Magneto, and then Onslaught Revelation, and then Into Inferno. Okay, those are the big event type things that are coming that we know are going to be driving the X-Men line. Now, the first one, The Last Annihilation, this is not really an X-Men event, right? So much as, insofar as Al Ewing is like, he's just an X-Men player at this point, right? Sword's going to tie into this. Like I said, there's going to be a Cable tie into this, and just because the X-Men are a cosmic kind of, they're in kind of Al Ewing's cosmic world now, through Sword and through the use of Mysterium, and now through Planet-Size X-Men. So we can't really differentiate X-Men stories like we used to and say like, oh, mutant stories are, on Earth, obviously with the exception of them going to space and doing stuff, but all sort of with the mindset of like, oh, and then we're going to come back. No, now like mutants are mutants are an empire. They're a galactic empire, and so everything that happens in Marvel Cosmic is tremendously relevant to what happens to mutants. So, and I said this previously, but like, if you're not reading Al Ewing's Guardians of the Galaxy, I think one, you should be. It's really good. But two, like, that's a piece of the X-Men franchise now in all but official title. Like that's a book that's going to coincide with Storm, or well, Storm, yes, but Sword in so many ways, and it's going to matter. So, Last Annihilation, what is the story going to be? Well, it was teased out in Guardians of the Galaxy number 15 last week. The big old fire pumpkin head here looks like one of the Green Goblin's pumpkin bombs. This is actually Dormammu, the Dread Dormammu, longtime Doctor Strange villain, having taken over Ego the Living Planet. So this is planet-sized Dormammu. Is going to be a threat of Last Annihilation proportions. Again, the fact that this is written by Al Ewing, one of the absolute best writers in comics right now, that gives me a lot of hope for the fact that it's going to be really good. But this will have some sort of ramifications on the X-Men's galactic, conquest schemes, right? Like this is, as the X-Men's plans get bigger, one thing we have to think about is on Earth, there are all these things you have to control or plan for, right? And even within that, then an Orcus breaks through and causes problems for mutant kind. Or Xeno captures Quentin Quire, and now there's all sorts of security concerns on Krakoa, right? Just think about how hard it is for the X-Men to manage the threats they face on Earth. Now expand those threats across the galaxy. And that's kind of what we're looking at, the early days of the post-Planet Rocco, post-Hellfire Gala X-Men comics, where now things that happen in Marvel Cosmic matter for the X-Men across the board, right? They cannot ignore those things because they, too, are looking to be a space-based empire. And they should be. Like, that's the long-term goal of all of this, is not just mutant survival, but mutant dominance. That is part of the Professor X Moira Magneto plan, is like how do we establish bases? How do we establish security? How do we establish a world and a galaxy where mutants can thrive? And to do that, they had to go to space, and they have to look at the galaxy. But first, they got to take on Dormammu. So let me know, like, any questions you have, any thoughts so far. Definitely open to them here in the comments. I did see a question early on that was, do you think a lot of what they're doing in the comics is setting up the MCU debut of the X-Men? This is definitely a popular question. I think in regards to Wanda specifically and the death of Scarlet Witch, I think one of the big theories right now is, okay, Wanda died in this issue, but Krakoa has resurrection protocols, either because Magneto pushes for it or through other ways. Could Wanda be resurrected, and be resurrected specifically as a mutant? That feels very much in play here. So basically restoring, undoing the retcon of 2015, it's very much in play, which I think I'm probably in favor of. Ultimately, I think that probably gives us more interesting stories to have this great pretender that someone's been labeled that, living with mutant kind. I'm also really curious, like, what Moira thinks of Wanda and her powers and what she's done, and was House of M planned? Did she see that in other lifelines? Like, there's a lot of, I think, really interesting questions you can do with bringing Scarlet Witch onto Krakoa in a more formal way. I don't anticipate that would be a thing that would be utilized in the MCU. That, I mean, certainly you could, but just I don't know. I'm just thinking about like WandaVision here, and it seems like it would be a tricky ask now to say, oh, also she's a mutant, because they pretty deliberately did not do that, right? All of the excitement and theorizing about, to the point where people were literally saying, oh, they've introduced mutants in the Marvel Universe, like midway through WandaVision, right? Like that was, people were saying like, no, it's like, we don't have to question anymore. It's done. It was not done. We thought it was Quicksilver from the Fox universe. It was Ralph Boner. We all got boned on that one, like it or not. And it's just like, I don't see them. I don't think the comics and the MCU are that aligned. I guess big picture, right? They just aren't. They clearly don't work that closely together. I think actually historically Marvel's been like really bad at putting out comics that tie into what's happening in the MCU. Not even story wise, just like character wise. I think they're finally like getting like they're kind of getting their act together. But I imagine a lot of that was just like they didn't have the information any earlier than anyone else, because why wouldn't you want to sell more comics, right? That's their goal. So I don't necessarily see that part of it. I think like if the MCU is going to utilize things that happened in X-Men, it's not going to be at the stage that we're reading them now. It's going to be the Krakoa era. I think if the MCU is going to utilize something that has happened in recent X-Men comics, they're going to look at House of X and Powers of 10 and figure out a way within that to bring mutants into their universe and have that be a cool launching pad. I'd be a little surprised and kind of weirded out if it was like they've been on Krakoa this whole time and nobody knew about it, because that actually seems to be in a lot of ways what they're doing with the Eternals. But it will be interesting to see. So no, I don't think, I think the comics operate pretty independently of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I think if you're a creator, if you're a writer, I think especially somebody like a Hickman who saw his characters, the Black Order, utilized in, the Infinity War, right? Like he's played this game before. I think definitely you're writing a story that you want to be the best comic story can be, but there has to be a thing in the back of your mind of like, and also this is really cool and could get picked up by the MCU for future plots. But no, I don't think it drives a majority of what they do for sure. So it's an interesting question though. It's an interesting question. I definitely agree. All right, let's talk about what comes next. So we got Last Annihilation, and then next. So that's going to be end of July. Then mid-August, the Trial of Magneto will officially begin. We've talked about this a little bit, so far. But again, like with Wanda dead, longtime Avenger, that's going to get the eye and the attention, of course, of the Avengers. From the issue 2 solicits we've seen, there's going to be a memorial. And it sounds like, okay, that's going to lead to Avengers versus Mutant Showdown type stuff. I hope a majority of the book is not just Avengers and X-Men clashing in, kind of no one speaking to each other based violence. I would be more interested in conversations around what it would mean to resurrect Wanda. I mean, I think the type of story that would be the most interesting to me would be Magneto saying, I want my family back. I'm in paradise now in Krakoa, but I don't have my family. I'm missing that piece of it. And really making a push for resurrecting Wanda and Pietro as mutants, putting them through Crucible, or I guess Wanda won't need to, but like maybe putting Quicksilver through Crucible, wherever the heck he is, of going to Sinister, and the piece of it that we still don't know, the piece of it that we definitely still don't know is like, in the teasers for this, there's talk of, there's a secret that Magneto's going to uncover that's going to send him into a rage. And that's the piece where things could get really interesting. I did a video a while back about what are Hickman's plans for Scarlet Witch. And one of the things I theorized there as a possibility would be like, what if Professor X and Moira and potentially even Mr. Sinister, because there's a weird Mr. Sinister Scarlet Witch connection if you go back and read a bunch of the old comics. What if they actually set it up to make it look like Wanda wasn't a mutant? What if that was them doing that? And what if Magneto uncovers that kind of secret? That to me would be the level of mystery and intrigue that would build to him going into a rage. It would ultimately lead to a retcon of bringing Wanda and Pietro back as mutants. And then we'd have a situation, too, where Magneto maybe is looking at Mystique trying to burn it all down. And he's like, yeah, maybe. And he's like, maybe she's onto something. That, to me, that's where it starts to get interesting. So I'm hopeful for a lot of big picture type conversation around like what are the plans for Krakoa and what has been done in the past and what's the thing that's going to really upset Magneto. I think that would be cool. So, I think he's going to, like we said, like try to get Wanda and Quicksilver onto Krakoa. I mean, one thing, one possibility too is like, so Wanda's dead, quote unquote. She could have been on Krakoa before this. Like humans can come live. Like if Magneto was just like, I just want my family with me. If you take out the Great Pretender part of it, which is a big part, they could just come live with him. I don't think Quicksilver and Wanda would want to do that. But then you factor in the Great Pretender part, and it's obviously like, you'd probably have Professor X and the Quiet Council being like, no, I don't care who she is. She specifically cannot live on our land. I think that's going to be a problem, even post-Resurrection. And I think, too, like, Wanda's not queued up for Resurrection. I've seen a number of people say, like, oh, big deal. She got killed in this issue, but this is Krakoa. Nobody dies anymore. Wanda's not a mutant. Wanda's not part of the Resurrection protocols. So that piece of it is like, that's very much a question. I mean, I think Magneto's going to have to fight to get Krakoa to even consider bringing her back. And that part of it is pretty interesting to me, because they're not, I don't know why they would do that, frankly. So, I'm curious to see how that plays out. Again, that's going to be August 18th is where it begins. And then that's going to set the stage for the Onslaught Revelation, which is going to begin, or is going to come out on September 22nd, which is a week before Inferno will begin. I talked a bit about the Onslaught Revelation. I mean, just think about, too, like, in aggregate, with all these events, like, what are we getting? What are we getting between... Throw Last Annihilation out of it, because that's kind of a separate thing. But with Trial of Magneto, with Onslaught Revelation, and with Inferno, like, those are all questions of the players in this era of X-Men, in this era of mutant comics, who are pulling the most strings, okay? Of the leadership, of the very head of the Krakoan experience, right? Magneto-based event, Professor X / Magneto Onslaught one-shot, and then Inferno, which, again, Hickman has teased as the sequel to House and Powers. Obviously, this is Moira, Professor X, Destiny, Mystique, Magneto, Emma, all the key players, right, involved. And obviously is going to be absolutely massive. But, like, it feels to me, even not just including Inferno, like we're about to get massive, massive story and massive revelations from the leaders, which we haven't gotten a heck of a lot from them in terms of the plan, in terms of where things are going. And I think what we're going to see by the end of this is I just think we're going to see that division right down the middle of, a schism, if you will, to use an X-Men parlance, of like those who are willing to go with the plan and those who want to go with Mystique kind of thing. And I think you're going to potentially you're going to have the first kind of separation of the mutant paradise, regardless of the numbers. It could be literally just Mystique and Emma, and, they free Sabretooth, and who else would go with them? We've talked about this before. Mr. Sinister, maybe he's interested. I don't know. I talked about Magneto potentially, right? You could have all these characters playing a role, and they could just form like a new Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, which would be fun, right? But even that is the most significant separation that mutant kind has seen in this era, because the whole like setup for House and Powers, one of the absolute biggest things is just throwing heroes and villains out the door and just being like, forget it, everyone's welcome here, and people actually like playing along with that. Like, that's no small thing. Like, I think it's somewhat easy to take for granted because of how effectively it was displayed, with Apocalypse and Professor X famously shaking hands. Back in House and Powers, I think it's House of X #5. But it's like, comics haven't really done that before. In Marvel Comics specifically, where the heroes and villains are just like, yeah, forget it. That was dumb. Let's all just be mutants. And let's all live here despite our vast differences and our very, very different histories. So that, I think, is going to get ruptured. And then the question is, does that getting ruptured align with what Moira saw coming, what she's seen coming through the Destiny Diaries and through her own lives? Does it start to break things, and then we go from there. I do want to comment here too. Like, I've seen this question comes up. I've talked about it previously. It comes up a lot, but people asking like, is it the end of the Hickman era? Where are we in the 3-act structure? Is this act number 2? I don't think it's the end. 2, I think probably the newer thing that I've been thinking about this week is like, I don't think we're in act 2 of 3 either. I really just don't think this story is going to play out that way. I think people have preconceived notions of like, oh, but for the pandemic, we'd be 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through this era. I really kind of don't think that's going to be the case. And I think too, like, if you're Jonathan Hickman, you can kind of like, he left after Secret Wars. Like, he was good. Like, dude did his Marvel Universe thing, Like, he elevated to being one of the biggest names in comics from a span of 2008 to 2015. He wrote Avengers and New Avengers during the MCU introduction of the franchise. He built his Secret Wars, which is literally the best comic book event of all time. Like, dude did his shared superhero universe diligence. Okay? He then went and finished East to West and Black Monday Murders, which I really look forward to more of someday, and other creator-owned stuff. But it's just like, and now Decorum. But it's like, he came back for X-Men. And he came back for a reason. He could sit as the head of X so long as this thing is working. And it's working. It's Marvel's best-selling book, by far. Fans, even with criticisms and hesitations, which what book doesn't have those things? Like, this is clearly the most exciting era of X-Men in such a long time. It's the clearest and biggest driver in the Marvel Comics line of success. I mean, you can look at individual pieces here and there in Immortal Hulk or a Daredevil, but if you look at actual franchises and kind of like, universes that are succeeding right now, it's X-Men. And it's kind of Marvel Cosmic on a related note because of the Al Ewing connection. Nothing else is really working at that level. They have their teen stuff. They have their Spider-Man stuff, their Avengers stuff. Those are all in need of resets or already undergoing them in the case of Amazing Spider-Man. And like Daredevil's really good, but it's like, that's just Daredevil. It's one book. X-Men is a very unique situation. So I think, and the thing too with Hickman as like the head of X is he can have all these plans. He can make time for the type of books he wants to do. He doesn't literally have to be writing X-Men as an ongoing. And we'll see how well that works. That'll be interesting, right? So like Jerry Duggan and Pepe Larraz are going to launch a new X-Men #1. We're not going to see any Hickman written X-Men comics for what, like 4 months? Until the end of September with Inferno, which as a fan of the writer and of the thinking, like, that's a bummer. But also, it gives these other players an opportunity to be like, okay, and is the line okay without that? Because if it is, then you can do that again. You can build in these breaks where then it's like this thing can go for a long time. Now, I'm not arguing for keeping the Krakoa era, this specific, idea in motion forever. That would be boring. Good stories should have endings. Good stories should conclude. And I was, so I don't know if I want to reveal this yet, but I'm working on a project, which you all may see here someday in the summer, actually on the YouTube channel, but that is involving me going back and listening to a bunch of Jonathan Hickman interviews. And I was listening to one from 2014, and one of the first things he said was, whenever I start a project, whenever I start a story, and I'm paraphrasing massively here, but basically it was like, I always know the ending. I always know what the ending is as I go. So, the question was basically like, do you change it? Do you alter it? And he's like, basically with like very few exceptions and almost never, I always know what the ending's going to be. I expect that's the case here for X-Men. I have no doubt. So I expect we will ultimately it's going to conclude, but I do think like this could extend much longer than everyone expects. It just has a momentum and it has a motion to it that is atypical for shared superhero universes, and I think there's an expectation of people like most writers, most ideas don't get years; they get 10 issues, right? Like we just saw, but this one might. This one might, and I think that could be really, really interesting. So Inferno, again, it's going to be a game changer. It's going to set up, okay, here's a new thing. Here's a new status quo for what it means to be an X-Men comic right now. But it's not going to be an ender. And it's probably not even going to be like setting up, a new Moira Lifeline or an alternate reality. I kind of don't feel like we're quite there yet. Although it's very possible because we're talking Moira and Destiny. So we'll see. We'll see. I got a comment here. Hawks and 6. Talking basketball again. What's the series now? Isn't it Bucks 3-1? Maybe I missed a game, but I thought okay, the Hawks won yesterday, so we're tied 2-2. Okay, I'm still gonna stick with my pick from last week of Suns over Bucks in 6 in the finals. I'm gonna stick with my guns there, even though I think the Bucks kind of suck. Not a Bucks guy from the Chicago area, but Giannis he's good. He's good at basketball. Trae Young though, I texted my family this week just to kind of get it under their skin, and I said, "Is Trae Young better than Jordan?" And I got some very angry texts back. But Trae Young has impressed me very, very much. No, I don't think he's better than Jordan. Everybody calm down. Get Scottie Pippen off the horn. I did not want him on my case because he's been coming for anyone and everyone. So, all right. Definitely let me know if you have any final questions here. I think otherwise, we can kind of put this to a conclusion. But yeah, I mean, that's what's coming for the rest of 2021 is everything is a build towards Inferno. And we're going to get, I think, real concrete movement on the leadership of Krakoa in ways that is going to be fascinating. We're going to get, I think, ultimately shifted or new status quos for Magneto, for Mystique, for Destiny, for Moira, for Professor X, and that's really, really exciting. I think that's going to be super exciting as an X-Men fan. So I love to see it. I mean, I think again, the order of operations here is July, you can expect The Last Annihilation, then Trial of Magneto in August, then in September, the end of September, scheduled right now, you get both Onslaught, Revelation, and Inferno. So good stuff to come. Let's see if there's any final questions here that I want to address. I'm seeing I like Suns in 6-2. Strongly agree. All right. Final question here I'll answer. How do you think Exodus will react to Wanda? I've seen some people proposing that Exodus could be the killer, which would be interesting. I think Mystique is... So if we're playing favorites, right? If we're playing odds, Mystique's the heavy favorite. Fabian Cortez is... we're talking about him, right? There are odds on Fabian Cortez. Probably third, I would say. Probably in the ballpark with Magneto, where it's just like the most obvious thing is it actually was Magneto. But then Fabian Cortez setting him up would make sense as well. I think then if you go kind of down the list to some of the outliers, some of the underdogs, Exodus is definitely one of those. Exodus is historically obsessed with Magneto and worships him. So could the character who is the most kind of in love with Magneto as the hero of Krakoa have seen him talking to Wanda and lost it and killed her? Not impossible. Not impossible. I could see it. I don't think... I think if we're looking at the Quiet Council, which again is kind of a mess right now, we don't actually have a full council. If we're looking at who would actually vote for Wanda, who would vote for a shot at redeeming Wanda, the Great Pretender right now? Controversial vote, right? You want to look at the Quiet Council records and start tweeting about them to get some political response from the Krakoan bases here. Anybody pro Wanda redemption is going to be frowned upon greatly, right? So you got Magneto, don't think Professor X would, honestly. Although if he sees everyone else isn't, maybe he's like, "Sure thing, buddy," and pretends. Exodus definitely not. Uh, Mystique obviously not. Or maybe Mystique does. That'd be a good fake out. And then it gets interesting with like Sinister. I don't know. It's a really interesting question. Like, how would everyone vote? I've really thought about that because Sinister I could see going either way of just being like, yeah, I want to do that experiment with her DNA. I want access to her DNA. I want her reality warping powers. Where do we consider her on an Omega level scale? Like Sinister's like the experiment of it probably excites him. If you look at like the Hellfire side of things, like Emma, Kitty or Kate, Sebastian, I don't see why any of them really would. I mean, Emma's kind of got an alliance with Magneto, so maybe there's just some, yeah, I'll do this thing for you if you do something for me that could come into play. And then if you look at like, well, Jean's off now and Storm's off now, so that whole summer council is wide open. But Nightcrawler, I don't know which way Nightcrawler will go. I have no idea where Kurt's head would be at on this one. So I think like I have no idea. Yeah, that's a great question. I love it. All right, so yeah, but definitely get in your theories here on the videos for who done it, for what's to come in the trial of Magneto, as that's the next big X event, and of course anything else that's coming. I love hearing about all of it. Who's your starting five for the Krakoan NBA team? I'd have to give that some thought as well. You know what? So there's two people I got put on the team that I wouldn't otherwise, but it's Gambit and Wolverine. And the reason is X-Men number 4, plotted by Jim Lee, scripted by John Byrne. Okay? The first issue post Chris Claremont, number 1 to number 3, Gambit and Wolverine play one-on-one, and they hit the most incredible shots you've ever seen. It is amazing and hilarious, and they are unbeatable, okay? Absolutely unbeatable. So you got to put Gambit and Wolverine on the team. I feel like they're probably your 2-3. They're probably a shooting guard, and maybe you could put Gambit as kind of a point forward kind of thing, but I don't necessarily know otherwise. Your point guard should definitely be someone who probably a telepath, right? So Teen Cable is in play. I don't see Jean loving sports. I don't see that. Maybe Monet would be good. I don't know. Let's put Colossus at the 4, and our center is going to be the Blob because of Scotty Young did a Secret Wars tie-in. It might actually be AVX. It's a Secret Wars tie-in, and there's like 1 or 2 panels of the Blob and Toad playing basketball, and they crack me up every time. So there you go. Krakoan starting 5. Final question. All right, we got a super chat here. Thanks so much for support, everybody, and thanks so much everybody for hopping on and listening. I love having people here to talk comics with. It says, love your cast with Zach. Thank you. That is a reference to My Marvelous Year. I recommend you all check it out if you want to play along with reading through the essential comics of the Marvel Universe. One question. How come nobody blames Pietro for the decimation? Wasn't he complicit in the event of House of X? Yes. Yes. Pietro, House of M itself, at the end of House of M, Pietro is revealed to blame in most ways for what has happened. And yet, it's Wanda who is vilified because she's the one who says the words, no more mutants. Pietro has kind of always been disliked. He is a difficult personality and has leaned into it oftentimes. So I think that's part of it, is like a turn on Pietro isn't as much of a turn anyway. Like people kind of didn't like him anyway. Whereas with Wanda, she was definitely friendlier and had more alliances. I think Quicksilver definitely deserves a ton of the scrutiny and a ton of the blame that Wanda gets. But at the end of the day, it was not his power set that decimated mutant kind. So it's a great question. I mean, I think I also don't quite know. One thing that I find kind of interesting is like how publicly available information is in in superhero universes, right? So like the idea that a lot of mutants would know that Wanda did this thing, like how does that get disseminated? Where does that come from? And then it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of like any story, right? Any big story that we see or any history that we read about today, it's like who's doing the telling, Where did it come from? Can you trust your sources? Are they credible, right? And if Pietro gets ignored and the headlines talk about Wanda and the body of the text says Pietro, but nobody reads the text, then Wanda gets blamed, right? So I think that's the rationale there. We also have a final super chat here, and again, thanks everybody so much. I love it. Could Moira have plotted and found a way to kill Wanda because she is a threat to Moira's timelines? I think if that was the case, Moira would not have waited until the gala. I don't expect Moira is going to be putting hits out on anybody like Wanda at this point. And although, like, the idea of, because a lot of people are like, hey, what's Moira doing? Like, well, she's just reading books, reading Destiny's Diaries all the time. The idea of her being in that room in her little no space and basically being like Oracle, from the Batman universe, but just like putting hits out on potential threats, like, I'd read that book. That'd be kind of cool. I don't think she killed Wanda. I think if she was going to do that, it would have been before House of M. I think if Moira really thought, based on her timelines, like, hey, Scarlet Witch is a threat, she can wipe out all of mutant kind, we need to stop that, I think she should have done that earlier if she didn't. Maybe she tried. Maybe she tried and failed. I think that'd be a cool revelation as well. But it's an interesting question. I would very much like to know what Moira thinks about Scarlet Witch, if anything, right? And that's the thing, too, is House of M new in this lifeline? We don't know. We still don't know. And those are types of questions that I would definitely like some more information on. So, all right. Thanks, everybody, so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Again, I will be back every Wednesday that I am available, which might not be this next one for personal reasons. So we'll see. If I'm here on 7/7, I'll do it. If I'm not, I won't. But otherwise, keep on subscribe to the Krakoa and Comic Book Herald channel, and you'll know exactly when videos are going up and when I'm doing a Casual Krakoa. So thanks everybody for listening. Thanks to those of you who got in questions. Thanks to those of you who support on the super chat. It's all super, super appreciated. And as always, enjoy the comics.